go there. I got all excited.
That's just because you know you've got a lot to cover.
Yeah, really.
The Mentor Exempted Village Board of Education special meeting for Tuesday, September 29th at 5:30 is called to order. This meeting is being held in accordance with section 3313.15 of the Ohio Revised Code. Mr. Wilson, please call the roll.
Mrs. Briner,
Here.
Mr. Buckley,
Here.
Mrs. Hassan,
Present.
Ms. Jisling,
Present.
Mr. Tuttle.
Present.
Please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation,
Under
under
God.
God, indivisible, with
Indivisible,
liberty and justice for all. This meeting is being video conferenced live and can be accessed at youtube.com/user Cardinal TV Mentor Ohio. First on the agenda is Superintendent's Report and Recommendations. Mr. Porter.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. President, members of the board. I am recommending approval of agenda items A1 related to certified personnel and A2 through A3, all related to human resource matters.
So moved.
Second.
Mr. Wilson, please call the roll.
Mr. Tuttle,
Yes.
Mrs. Hassan,
Yes.
Mrs. Briner,
Yes.
Ms. Jisling,
Yes.
Mr. Buckley.
Yes.
Thank you. This concludes my portion of tonight's agenda.
Next on the agenda is the Board of Education's report and recommendations, Section A, Business. Mr. Wilson, are you speaking to the delegate?
Yes. This year, the OSBA Capital Conference is still being held, but done virtually. Part of the conference every year is for the conducting of a business meeting to set the legislative agenda for the year and take care of other business-related items. Annually, we're requested to designate a board member that plans on attending as the delegate authorized to vote on behalf of the board, and an alternate in the event that the delegate is not able to attend a business meeting. So this item does not take a motion and second. It can be based on volunteer or interest or your preference as board president to do that. The Capital Conference this year is November 7th through the 10th. I believe that the business session will be held on November 7th.
Do I have a volunteer to be the delegate?
I've done it every year since I've been on. I'm happy to continue to do it.
Okay, with no objections, then Mary, you win the prize. Thank you.
And we need an alternate.
Y'all
Anyone?
already
If it, thanks,
Tom,
Tom.
you wanted, Tom? are you-
alternate in case Mary needs a backup.
All right, thank you, Tom. All right, and we don't have to vote on that. That's correct, Mr. Wilson?
No,
All right, so let's move to Chief Financial Officer's report and recommendations. Mr. Wilson.
Yes, as you know, the main purpose of our meeting this evening was to have a presentation of the 2020-2021 budget, and then a request that it be adopted and filed with the Lake County Budget Commission. I've prepared a presentation for you. The board received the actual budget document last week, as well as the Citizens Financial Advisory Committee. Given the very unusual nature of the budget development and this entire budget year, we did not convene the Finance Committee in advance. We believe there'll be some very important discussions to have with them as a part of the update and the renewal of our 5-year fiscal projections later on. So as always, I'd like to focus on the general fund budget, recognizing that there are many other funds that the board also manages and will be approving tonight, including permanent improvement fund, food service, uniform school supplies, various trust funds and student activity funds, state grants and federal grants, and some other local funds. Those are somewhat predefined by the amount of revenue and the historical use of those funds. The main discretionary fund and the biggest dollar fund is the general fund budget. So as I've done every year, I develop a theme, and this year it seemed appropriate to have the theme reflect where we are at this moment in time. So managing the challenges is our theme. And even with that theme, we're still anchored in our 5 fiscal beliefs that you can see there on the screen. And we continue to value these fiscal beliefs as we develop not only the budget, but execute the budget every year. And that's led us to a very sound position as a school district as it relates to fiscal management. This year's budget was developed in a modified way so as not to take our administrative team away from the very intense planning that was necessary for opening schools this year. After consulting with Bill, we determined to this year have me rely on last year's actual budget performance, as well as layer in COVID-19 crisis fiscal impact data and use that as the development of our budget, and also recognize we will provide more flexibility to department heads and building administrators as they administer the budget this year to adjust allocations as necessary. That may also include a supplemental appropriation at some future point if absolutely necessary. So having said that, as I referred, and I apologize, the print's a little small on the slide, but you've seen it, the COVID-19 fiscal impact has been very significant. This data, and it's also found on page 7 of the budget document, shows that last year we lost over $2.1 million in revenue collectively and had new expenses of $1,026,000 for a negative fiscal impact of $3,144,000. This year, our negative revenue number is expected to be $1,535,000, and our additional expenses $6,460,000, and some expected reduction in substitute costs given the fact that we're not in the building 5 days a week on student instruction, for a total fiscal impact this year of $7,603,000. The 2-year fiscal impact of the COVID-19 crisis is $10,747,759. To the Board of Education's credit, the support of our conservative fiscal management of the school district, our focus and adherence to not only board policies, but the fiscal beliefs, has allowed us to be in a very, very small number of school districts, both in Ohio, regionally and nationally, that was able to provide effective remote learning with the instructional technology we had and were able to expand, as well as have the hybrid model beginning very near the normal start time of this year, providing a safe, productive learning environment for our students. We were able to do all that, again, because of our conservative fiscal management and a little bit of good fortune that we're in the middle of our normal levy cycle to do it. I've tried to adjust many of the slides in the budget book and this presentation to net out the COVID-19 crisis fiscal impact when doing a statistical analysis with prior year performance to try to get a little bit more of an apple to apple. The first example of that is this slide where we show the annual staffing adjustments. You'll note the top part has some blue numbers. Those are the COVID-19 related impacts. Our normal staffing was adjusted by 1 additional nurse and 4 additional classroom assistants. In addition to that, we have 1-year long-term substitute contracts for 49 teachers and 19 and a half other support staff for the school year, for a total COVID-19 staffing of 68.5 full-time equivalent positions. Hopefully they're positioned legally and structurally to be 1-year positions, and hopefully we'll find next school year somewhat more normal than what we had to deal with this year. The next slide is a summary of our revenues. And again, the far right side, I added a total budget, COVID-19 budget impact, and then the net budget, so there could be some statistical comparisons. Even before the COVID-19 crisis impact, this year's budgeted income is less than last year's actual income. The primary reason for that is last year was an extraordinary year for the collection of delinquent real estate taxes and some tax incentive payments that we received. This year's real estate tax revenue exceeds what was in the fiscal projection for this year. And that's primarily a result of the benefit of the actual second half 2019 tax collections we received in August that came in about $1.2 million above what we had expected. So that's the main reason for the variance. But you can see pre-COVID-19 impact, we're budgeting 2.68% less revenue than actually received last year. And then when we factor in the reduction of state funding, lost interest rates, lost student fees, and miscellaneous revenues that won't be collected as a result of the hybrid model, we're down to 100,306,683, or 4.15% less than last year. Every year, the budget provides some historical context to our view, and you'll see on this slide, we show back to our crisis days, year-over-year change in overall revenue. And you'll see that the last, with the exception of 18-19, we saw some larger than expected increases every year. That reflects our county treasurer's very focused efforts to collect accumulated delinquent taxes, as well as, again, some additional tax incentive payments based on some city development of commercial property. So 18-19 did see a dip. There weren't as many delinquent taxes, and you'll see there's consistently several red numbers there. Overall, the revenues are somewhat flat from year to year. Every year, I need to note that our district suffers from some policy changes by the Ohio legislature back in 2004. Changes to our state subsidy, the elimination of a school bus subsidy, the phase out of the tangible personal property hold harmless reimbursements, the elimination of the 10,000 personal property exemption reimbursement, and utility deregulation hold harmless payments being eliminated. This year, we will be collecting $17,115,000 less than if this state legislature had not made those policy changes. That's almost 17% of our revenue base. And again, I'll speak a little later on about some potential new threats to our finances. The next page, and again, I apologize, it's a little small, but it's a summary that you see every year of the budgeted expenses. Again, the last three columns show, in this case, the total budgets first, the COVID-19 budget, and then the net budget, so that we can show you the impact. I'm sorry, it goes the net budget, COVID-19 total budget. You'll see that the budget this year includes the first or the second actually of what will become annual general fund transfers to capital projects as pre-identified in the 5-year capital plan. Last year was the first transfer of $1,090,000. This year it's $2,831,000. So based on the 5-year schedule, we'll see later, that will be a new annual expense. The board policy that created the general fund operating reserve gave us 3 fiscal years to fully fund to the 5% allowed limit, and then also to implement the 10% reserve in our cash balances. This is our 3rd fiscal year, and you'll see a one-time transfer of $2,107,439 to fund the reserve fund. And we'll have a slide on that in a minute. So pre-COVID impact, the budget growth this year, if we exclude that one-time transfer to the reserve fund, but include what's now going to be an annual capital projects transfer, 6.83%. The COVID impact, as I mentioned a moment ago, on the expense side is $6,068,000 of new expense, or 5.91 more than last year. So the total budget this year will be 12.74% more than what was actually spent last year. And again, because of our prudent conservative fiscal management and our middle of a life cycle of the 2016 levy, we did not have to restrict Bill's ability to thoroughly plan for the hybrid instructional meeting and do the things that were necessary for a safe learning environment this year. The following page again is the historical context of expense growth year over year. This takes actual expenses. You'll see that after our fiscal crisis in 2004, there was some significant growth in the budget as we recalibrated from the crisis reduction of almost 300 positions. But in more recent years, annual year over year growth has typically been 1% or less. The last 2 years, as we began to expand programming and embracing more technology, you'll see 18-19 year over year growth of 3.74%. Last year, 3.52%. So a little bit more than the historical average, but based again on the instructional initiatives of the last couple years. The next slide is what you've seen before, is what was presented to the board as our 5-year spending plans for capital plans, technology, furniture, and vehicles. Technology, furniture, and vehicles are all traditionally funded out of the general fund, and based on historical funding levels, in most years are fully funded based on the 5-year plans presented. The exception to that is our capital plan. And you'll see up in the first line, there's a row of red numbers, and that goes back to the $2,831,000 this year to be transferred. Next year, $3,370,000, $3,295,000, $2,609,000, $1,470,000. So that is to supplement our permanent improvement fund every year to ensure that we are maintaining and extending the useful life of our facilities and enhancing the use of the facilities, particularly the campus enhancements that's been presented to you. On the expense side, and one of the additional negative impacts of state policy changes has been the growth in voucher programs. And this chart you see every year shows open enrollment students that we lose. The John Peterson Autistic Scholarship Program, the Traditional Autistic Scholarship Program, and charter school students. Last year, we lost 181.28 full-time equivalent students and had a new expense of $1,645,973. There's significant attempts to resurrect the stalled legislation for ed choice vouchers, which could have a very detrimental effect on us. The ed choice voucher expansion, in essence, is saying that any resident student of the school district that is of school age is entitled to a voucher of at least $6,000, whether they attend our schools or not, whether they ever attended our schools or not. So we could have someone that's entering kindergarten, we could have someone entering 12th grade in one of the non-public schools, and we would be charged that $6,000, even though they've never, ever attended our school district. That we expect this to be resurrected no later than a part of the new state budget development that will start with the governor's budget presentation the end of January, and the budget has to be adopted no later than July 1st. So we are very actively advocating through our professional organizations to voice our concerns about that there's two dimensions to it, obviously. One is it good public policy, and the other is who pays for it. If the state believes it's good public policy, it should come out of the state budget, not a chargeback to individual districts that have never educated the children. So we will keep you updated on that. The overall summary, and this is very complicated this year compared to previous presentations, there's two summaries here for revenue. One's the total revenue. It's 1.06 less than last year's budget, again, because of changes in tax collections. It's 3.73% higher than we projected last October. That reflects our good second half tax collections and of about 1,200,000 above what we had budgeted or projected, and more tax incentive grant funds that came in. This year's budget revenue compared to last year's actuals are minus 2.68%. When we factor in the loss of revenue from COVID-19, you'll see those numbers increase by about 1.5%, so that our actual budgeted revenue this year will be 4.15% less than our actual revenue last year. On the next slide, we present the same thing, but we have three categories for expenses. First, the total expense growth, budget to budget, budget to projections, most importantly, budget to actual was 14.79%. If we remove the one-time transfer to fully fund the general fund operating reserve, the budget to actual increase is 12.74%. And if we net out the COVID impact of $6,068,000, then the budget to actual increase would be 6.83. Still much more than our historical norm or recent norm, but something that we believe was justified in the budget development. And of course, that leaves us to the bottom line then. And you'll see that we were fortunate again, as we're in the middle of a levy cycle and reflect very careful, prudent, conservative management. We're starting the year with $72,192,000. With layering in the income less the loss of COVID income, layering in the expenses, the one-time transfer to general fund operating reserve, the COVID-19 budget, we expect that beginning balance to be reduced from 72 million to 54,614,000. And when we honor board policy 8.02.01 that says we should reserve 10% of that cash balance to supplement the 5% general fund operating reserve to get to the best practice target of 15%, our available cash for future spending is 44,344,992. As always, we show you a chart, and we're going to talk a moment about the key financial indicators. But on the next chart, one of those key financial indicators is which year do we see expenses exceeding revenue and begin to do what I call deficit spending. Some will call it non-funded spending. And you'll see the lines dramatically cross this year because of the things we talked about. Historically, both at the Board of Education's urging and the Citizens Financial Advisory Committee's urging, I've refined my budgeting and forecasting methodology to try to be as precise as possible. And as you know, my standard line is, if I could predict with certainty what was going to happen 5 years from now, you wouldn't see me. I'd own my own island and have my own country somewhere and disconnect. So we
Without COVID.
yes, on our best assumption. So on the next slide, you'll see the context there that we've now increased our annual accuracy. The last 2 years, we were 98.7% accurate on revenue and 98.3% accurate on revenue and 98.1% accurate on expenses, 98.4% accurate on expenses. In both those years, approximately 0.5 percentage points of accuracy was lost because of our good fortune of having health insurance rate renewals at 0 or less than the assumed 8% increase. So I think that with our revisions to the budgeting model that will be reflected both in this budget and future forecasts, we're now between 98, 99% accuracy on both revenue and expenses. So we're, with the guidance of the Finance Committee and the board, I think that's enhanced all of these numbers. As I mentioned several times, the general fund operating reserve, the board policy said within 3 fiscal years to fund it to the legal limit of 5%. And that every year that we have revenues that exceed expenses, allocate needed funds to the reserve. You'll see the policy balance is $5,134,000, the bold number there in the middle. Our balance as of June 30th was $3,027,000. So we needed to transfer the entire excess revenues above expenses last fiscal year and add another $151,211 to bring it up to the board policy amount of the 5 million. So that 5 million, the chart I showed you on the bottom line chart of the reserve against cash balance now says we fully implemented that board policy. I try to provide what I call key financial indicators, which are benchmarks and things that I think we all need to pay attention to say, do we have a structurally sound budget? Do we have something that should cause us alarm? And I've summarized on the next page, this is a new chart I've not used before, but a summary of those key financial indicators. In the first, and we have exhibits every year, and I always talk about it, is monitoring annual staffing changes compared to student enrollment changes. And we've been very good. We were out of whack prior to our fiscal crisis, where we had actually dropped over 2,000 students, but added 130 plus staff members. So clearly something was structurally unsound to where we've corrected that. As you know, Bill commissioned a new enrollment study in December of 19 that validated what we've been observing. We're basically flattening out as far as student enrollment and may see some modest growth going forward. This year has been distorted because of COVID-19 crisis, but that's generally the case. This year, as I mentioned earlier, we've added 5 staff positions, and we have the expected enrollment pre-COVID-19 was 16 more students. So we're kind of entering a little bit of a gray area there of aligning changing in staffing to changing in enrollment, but the changes again were based on programming decisions that Bill made and the board supported. The next key financial indicator is, when do we begin deficit spending? And as you'll see in the supporting charts after this page, this is the year. And where I predicted that in some other years and then good fortune happened, this year there's some significant difference. One is we enhanced all of our formula calculations where we're 98 to 99% accurate. So there's should be less variation. And the COVID-19 spending is pretty definitive as far as all those one-time expenses. We are predicting this year we will deficit spend, we'll have 11,509,000 more in expenses than revenue. And that's kind of a tipping point, as you know. That means we got to start spending our cash reserves, and you can only do that once. Once the cash reserves are gone, we're in a difficult position. The state of Ohio requires we have a balanced budget. We're not, unlike the federal government, we are not allowed to deficit budget. The next obvious one then related to that's what's the impact of deficit spending on the levy cycle? I would say now we have no clue. We're all hoping and praying that the COVID-19 crisis ends sometime this academic year. And if it does, that will be good news, but there's the potential that if we deficit spend again next year or even the year after that at a lesser rate, but still deficit spend, we're looking at the possibility of needing a new levy in 2024, or maybe with some good fortune, 2025. So the crisis and the impact has certainly accelerated and shortened the levy cycle from our 2016 levy. It will still be good news, in my opinion. Not everybody will agree with this, but in Ohio, historically, levy cycles are 4 years, maybe 5 years at the most. And again, our last new levy was 2016. If we go to 2024, 2025, we're talking about an 8 or 9 year cycle. And that's coming off a cycle of 12 years before the 2016 levy. So we need to be very sensitive of the impact on the levy cycle, but it's not an immediate crisis for us. Two national benchmarks on structural soundness is what percent of the budget spent on salary and benefits. And the national benchmark is it should be less than 80%. If you account for fixed cost and mandatory spending, it almost always is at least 20% of the budget. So to the extent that you're allocating more than 80% on staff and benefits, you're eliminating your ability to fund the mandatory cost. I'm pleased to tell you this year, as we've consistently been, we're at 76.3% of our budgets being allocated to salary and benefits. So we're in a very good place. The next national benchmark is what percent of the budget's allocated to direct student instruction. Ohio, like virtually every state, has a chart of accounts that mirrors the federal handbook on how to account for spending in K-12 education. And using that, this year we're at 63.28%. So we're almost at that target structural balance of you should be spending at least 65% of your budget on direct student instruction. When we look at pupil services, which are counselors, psychologists, some other faculty members that are not in the classroom but have direct student engagement, that would move us up to 68.55%. I should note that historically, and you'll see in one of the supporting documents here, we're ranging 62, 63%. So we've been consistent in our allocation. We're just slightly below that national impact. The last key financial indicator is recognizing in Mentor, our primary revenue source are real estate taxes, and the majority of those are paid by homeowners. We annually are tracking what's the net per pupil per day cost to a homeowner, not a business owner, not a commercial property, not a utility, but to a homeowner. And you'll see in the chart here in a second, This year, it's $5.64 an hour or $42.33 per day per student and real estate taxes paid by a homeowner. And we believe that's great value when you look at, I think many of us pay a babysitter as much as we're spending per hour to provide a high quality education.
Dan, say that again. What was that hourly rate?
It's
Per day.
$5.64. And I've got a chart coming up.
Oh, okay.
That has that $5.64 per hour, $42.33 per day. And that's in the budget book. It's also here. The
Okay.
backup charts, all the things I just said are the next few slides. One of them that if you go forward one more, the green bars there, you'll see that as we're tracking changes in student enrollment, changes in staffing enrollment, we layer in benchmarks of state averages and when they're available, federal averages. And so we look at consistently our pupil teacher ratio. This year we're budgeted at 14.07 students per teacher. The state average is 16.67. The federal average is 16.3. So we have somewhat smaller classes than the state and national average. And I've gone back, you read right to left, and the bottom half takes us back 2010. Even in 2010, we were 14.38. So we've consistently had class sizes of between 14 and 15 students. Support staff, there's one support staff person for every 23.32 students. And you'll see consistently that's ranged in the 22 to 24 range. And there's no benchmark I could find. Importantly, administrators, you'll see we have one administrator for every 215 students. And historically, we've ranged above 200. And you see the state average is 135, and it ranged at one time up to about 160. So that's saying we have less administrators, one administrator per more students, which means we're more efficient and less top heavy than the state average or the federal average. And again, you see the federal average of the last data that was published was well over 200. So proportionally, we kind of track those ratios. The next slide again shows that withdrawal from our savings account this year expected to be the 11,509,000. The next page is a history and the status of all of our operating levies. We're talking about the possibility of a new operating levy in 2024, 2025. Near the very bottom of this chart, third from the bottom, in May 7, 2013, we renewed for a 10-year period the original emergency levy that got us out of fiscal emergency. It will expire at the end of tax year 2023, which is the end of calendar year 2024. We will need to renew that levy. It generates $14,275,000 annually. So in 2023 will be the earliest we're allowed to pursue a renewal, which we would intend to do. You'll see the last renewal passed by 73.2% yes vote. Different today, not only the COVID crisis, but we are seeing a very unsettling trend around the state of very strong, consistent districts not being able to renew operating levies.
Sure.
And we're somewhat concerned that if that trend continues based on the national and state economy, based on just a general mood about supporting government at the local level, we want to be a little sensitive to that. And we're going to carefully monitor this November's election with some school districts are trying for a second time to get a levy renewal. The next part is the backup on the percent of salary and benefits compared to the entire budget. The next is the 2 pages is the backup on the percent of the budget spent on direct instruction. And then we have a bar chart one more page that, Tom, to your question, and this is also in the budget book, that
Yes.
shows year over year how much we spend per day total is the red bar. How much is the cost to, I'm sorry, that's the, yes, the overall cost. The gray bar is the residential property owner's proportional share of it. So that you'll see the $5.64 to $42.33. And you'll see that's been somewhat consistent over time. And again, we would argue when you look at this unit of analysis, there's great value being delivered to the community. As always, I want to highlight open issues as we go through this fiscal year. The second item there is once we hopefully get back to normal and finish our temporary use of the James A. Garfield building, we're able to finalize a sale and remove the annual carrying cost of that facility. As you'll note down there, 3 from the bottom, begin to plan for general fund operating renewal in 2023, we just talked about, and then monitor the COVID-19 crisis to determine how that's going to impact future funding needs. So I know I talked a lot there and kind of fast, but that's the overall summary. The actual board resolution will ask you to approve the entire budget, which we distributed. The entire budget totals $168,893,826.47. So I'd be happy to respond with any questions, and then I would ask that the board approve the budget and authorize me to file with the Lake County Budget Commission.
You know,
And Go ahead.
go ahead, Ginny. Go ahead.
I had just one question. On pages 2 and 10 of the budget document, there was reference, and you and I talked about this earlier today, that there's a slight waiver in the number of, or the percentage of students that are in private or parochial schools. And the thought that there's also a slight drop in the number of students attending. Do we have an idea of how many students in our district are being homeschooled? I don't know if that's a number Bill would know or that you know,
You mean
Dan.
doing the Mentor schools online?
No, they're
The
not our
traditional
students.
homeschooling?
That parents have opted to file with the county to educate their children on their own.
I don't have that specific number. Perhaps Bill does. We can get that for you. On page 10, you'll show last year we had 851 students that were school age residing within the boundaries of the school district, not attending the school district. So some amount of those would be the homeschool students. We'll have to get that information for you.
I was curious because with the pandemic, I'm thinking that would have been a likely reason why some families might have opted for trying homeschooling, even if they hadn't done that before, because they could create maybe small clusters of cohorts so that their kids would have a different experience than they would with any of the offerings that are available otherwise. So my curiosity is, are they likely to come back to us, or may those students continue indefinitely as homeschool students?
I'll defer to Bill's judgment. I would tell you it's very difficult to estimate right now.
That's hard to tell. And I, you know, I would hang my hat on the fact that we have a lot of options, a lot of programs, extra things that we can provide that homeschooling may not. Now you can, through the law, now access some things as a homeschooler, but I don't know that it's quite the same as being part of the school community. So that's a pretty open-ended question. It's tough to nail down.
Do we know how many students are participating in the secondary, what was PSEO, the College Credit Plus program? Do we know how many? Is it roughly the same as it had been, let's say last year and the year before? Did you see an escalation or a drop?
I can find out the exact numbers, but I think there's been a drop.
Okay. I know COVID has just thrown everything into
Yeah.
Yes.
chaos. And I know that Lakeland is being a primary educator for College Credit Plus, that they have, their calendar looks different. They're doing some online teaching as well.
Yes, just to clarify, College Credit Plus students are still officially enrolled in our school district and typically still attend a significant number of classes within the school district, different than a homeschooled student or a private school student.
Thank you.
Bill and Dan, I'm wondering, or I just posed the question. I'm thinking that we need to get our financial picture, what's happening because of COVID, out to the community. And perhaps it's time to get a commenter out to show where we are now and where we hope we're going. And at the same time, talk about our programming and what we've been able to do and not be able to do because of COVID. I think if we aren't keeping them informed, about how our money's being spent and why, I think, if we spring a levy or even a renewal without that background information, I just think we should be proactive in preparing the community for what's coming down the road.
Good point, Ken.
Excellent, yes.
I'd
Because
be
my
happy to work
concern
with
is
Bill on
we're
that.
gonna run into that renewal, which is a substantial amount of millage, right in the same point where we're probably gonna need new dollars. And how you navigate that, like, anytime you put anything on the back, people don't necessarily pay attention to the detailed descriptions. They look at the millage and whether it's a renewal or new money, old money, they just vote or make those decisions. And if we have to have a second ballot run for whatever reason, there's that, we just passed a levy. What did you do with that money? And that's always a little bit worrisome.
Bill, do you know offhand when the last commenter went out and when the next one's scheduled to go?
I do not have that at my fingertips, but I can find that out. We've got that. I mean, we've been on the schedule, I think. So
Yeah, again, I guess I'm proposing that we move it up if possible.
Okay.
I hate to give you more work, but I just think the community can look at this as, oh, look, they're doing fine. Especially the, huge number of people that don't have kids. And, some of the questions that I'm getting from senior citizens, number one, they don't understand school finance. And number two, they don't know what we're spending our money on and why. What somebody asked me why we were still why do we need all these subs when all the kids are at home? I said, well, they're not all home.
Right.
So,
Good
So-
point. Things are looking very different, and I think it's a good time for us to communicate with the public and give them an update.
yeah.
I agree. I think it's such a good idea to show that because we were able to save money in other ways in other years, we could offer options for our students that kept them safe even if they were in person, and that we could manage class sizes. That was a huge undertaking to make that happen. And I'm so grateful for that.
and
We're-
besides the, the commenter, we're also going to continue with some of our usual things. I have meetings with PTAs coming up in the next month or two, and a lot of those will be virtual, but we're still getting in front of audiences where I think it's important to share some of that information. Our state of the school will still happen, even if it looks a little different. So there are different opportunities we have. Same thing with Rotary and other, other entities. So we will continue to get the message out.
Well, and the last time we did a survey, I can't remember when it was, but a lot of people really do get a great deal of information about our schools from that commenter,
Yes.
especially the senior citizens. They're not into stuff online. It's, oh, good, a
Right.
magazine I can read.
Right.
And I think it's always had a polished presence.
Right.
It speaks well of the district and is informative. It's not too long, but it has real meat to it and is a very attractive presentation.
Oh, good. Are there any more questions for Mr. Porter or Mr. Wilson?
I have a question for Mr. Wilson. You showed like there were some major revenue losses due to COVID. What are those?
The expenses for COVID-19?
Like we have some revenue losses due to COVID.
Yes, yes. The primary one is the reduction in state subsidies that
Oh, okay.
because the state's primary revenue source is sales tax revenue and personal income tax revenue,
Okay.
both which were dramatically affected by the COVID-19 crisis. So last year, here we go. We had a reduction of 1,976,000 in our state subsidy. There was an adjustment to how those reductions were distributed to each of the 612 school districts, and we had 43,000 offset. And we also had some federal money as an offset. So last year, our net loss of revenue from state subsidy was 1,038,000. This year, the state's told us 1,109,000. We also are losing student fees because of a lot of the student activity programs with our hybrid model will not occur. And we're losing building rental income because, again, we're erring on the side of safety. So that comprises the 1,535,000 of
Oh.
revenue loss.
Oh, okay.
Are there any more questions for Mr. Porter or Mr. Wilson?
Are there any
just a-
guesses?
I have one question. I'm looking at that page that had the red and the black and the
Yeah.
cost per taxpayer and the cost
Yes.
per hour. What were the numbers that you used for the denominator, and what's the other one?
Numerator.
Yeah, the two numbers. What did that come from? I want to tag it in this budget model so
All right.
I understand that and I can put my head around the number that says the cost per
Yeah.
day or the cost per hour from 2009 to 2020.
Yes.
The homeowner's contribution increased by 42%,
Yes.
Oh. 10 years.
Yes.
And we have had new homes built and more tax revenue coming in. The number of students went down from 8,245 to 7,492. That's a decrease. So
I will send you the formula, but it's basically taking the amount that we actually spent in past years, what we budget to spend this year, dividing by 180 instructional days, divided by the number of students enrolled, divided by, and that gives us a daily rate. So the total actual expenses divided by 180 days is the cost for 1 day of instruction, divided by the number of students gets us to the cost for one student for 1 day. And then divide that by 7 hours. I blended the different elementary, middle school, high school days and took 7 hours to get the hourly rate. So total expenses divided by 180 instructional days divided by number of students is a daily amount divided by hourly, 7 hours in a day. Then I took the proportion of total tax revenue we receive and what portion of that comes from residential taxes versus non-residential taxes.
So I
So
could work
I'll-
back from that number then, Dan, right?
What's that?
Based on what you said, when working forward to get to that number, I can mathematically reverse that sequence
Yes,
and
yes,
come back to the number of dollars and cents.
yes. And for the total spending, yes, for the residential side, that's one where I'd have to give you the number. I'll get the formula for cost per day, cost per pupil. I'll send that out.
Okay, are there any more questions?
I was just gonna ask, do we have any sense of whether the governor is wanting to attempt to restore the cuts? You know,
Funny.
the new budget, do you feel like he was troubled by having to take money away at a time where our expenses were expanding so dramatically?
Well, I think the governor realized it was a very difficult decision. Again, the state has the same constitutional requirement the local governments have. They must have a balanced budget. They cannot adopt a deficit budget, and they can deficit spend the first year of a 2-year cycle, but the 2-year state budget combined cannot be deficit. So they impose for every agency that receives state funding, direct state agency, they impose cuts anywhere from 10 to 20% of their operating budgets, including the Ohio Department of Education. Their administrative budget was cut almost 20%. And then there were some subsidies they could not cut, that the homestead and rollback reimbursement on property taxes is fixed statutorily, couldn't be reduced. But our state subsidy, city subsidies, library subsidies, other local government spending subsidies were all reduced by amount. And again, it was because they have to have a balanced budget also. Going forward, until the state budget director can confidently say, we're going to see restored collection levels for personal property or personal income tax revenues and sales tax revenues, they're going to be very hesitant to go back to previous spending levels, let alone add on. And I think given the conservative nature of both the Ohio House of Representatives and Ohio Senate and the governor, the idea of tax increases probably isn't going to go very far. I think they're going to live within their means.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Any more questions? Hearing none, could I have a motion recommending the annual appropriations for the 2020-2021 school year be approved as presented by Mr. Wilson?
So moved.
Second.
Mr. Wilson, would you call the roll?
Ms. Jisling,
Yes.
Mrs. Hassan,
Yes.
Mrs. Briner,
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle,
Yes,
Mr. Buckley.
Yes.
And I apologize, I was so long-winded. I told Bill I could do this in 20 minutes, so
No,
I got on a roll. You know I'd love to talk numbers.
that's true, but we appreciate your thoroughness and your clear presentation and your willingness to answer our questions. So thank you, Dan, for your work. At this point in time, could I have a motion to adjourn this meeting?
So moved.
so moved.
Second, please.
Second.
Second.
Mr. Wilson, did you get that?
I got, Tom made the motion, Jenny seconded, unless.
Sounds good.
someone corrects me.
That's correct. Please call the roll.
Mr. Tuttle,
Yes,
Ms. Jisling,
Yes.
Mrs. Briner,
Yes.
Mrs. Hassan,
Oh, yes.
Mr. Buckley.
Yes.